Have you noticed that your son, daughter, or the players you're coaching have gotten a lot taller, but also an awful lot more awkward over the past few months? Are they struggling with skills that they were previously really good at? And are they often complaining of being a bit sore and picking up all these like little niggles that just seem annoying? Do their energy levels feel a bit off? Has their speed or their ability to change direction just gotten an awful lot slower or more awkward as well? Have you even noticed a few bits around they're starting to change friend groups, or they're just getting interested in a lot of different things? This is all perfectly normal behaviour as they go through their growth spurt, or what's known as PHV. In this video, we're going to look at what's causing all this, but more importantly, how to support teenagers across how much they train, what type of training they're doing, what they eat, how best to recover, and how to manage all the new social and emotional development. So what actually is the growth spurt? It's known as peak height velocity, or PHV. It's where teenagers or late childhood are going through the largest amount of growth that they're going to go through, so having the biggest jump in height or limb length that they have since in or around the age of 0 to 2 years old. The majority of this growth will actually come in their arms and legs, but will change a bit based on the individual. But their general proportions or anthrometrics will go from having legs and torso that are reasonably similar in length to a somewhat smaller torso and much longer legs and sometimes longer arms as well. Girls will generally hit their PHV or their growth spurt before boys, which is the main sign of going through biological maturity. So for girls, this will happen somewhere in between 11 and around 14 and a half, whereas for boys it'll happen somewhere between 12, 12 and a half and 15 or 16. Up to around age 10, there aren't actually huge differences in terms of strength and size between boys and girls, but over the next 3 to 4 years, they tend to go on two essentially completely different paths in terms of their growth, strength, size, and often even more times social and emotional maturity. Just before and during their peak height velocity and maturation, this is where they'll also start to develop a lot of their sex characteristics, and there'll be huge changes as well in terms of what happens to males versus what happens to females. They'll grow a lot more in different parts of the body, but this also has huge knock-on impacts in terms of their social and emotional development, and just generally coping with all the various changes that are happening to them in terms of physically, but also where their interests and social relationships are going. All this growth, coupled with a varied and developing mind, it's just a really complex time for these young people. Not just for playing sport, but how they manage life, make decisions, make friends, and generally just kind of figure out who they are. A recent paper by Johnson et al., some of whom are based at West Ham and have been monitoring this in their academy and young players over the last few years, have made various suggestions around how to approach this from a multifactorial approach, looking at a few different avenues in terms of training load, S&C, nutrition, sleep, but also social and emotional support. We're going to use that as the basis for the guidance I'm giving in this video today. The first thing that's important to monitor and look at adapting a bit is overall training load. This is essentially how much they're training or playing are both combined. We can measure this both externally and internally, and we'll look at a combination of both in a second. But first of all, externally is the total amount of work that's done. This is often done in overall time spent training, distance covered, whether it be through GPS or you have other factors to measure how much you've done, or weight lifted in a particular resistance training session. Internally is about the internal response of the player to the particular session. One of the most common ways looking at here is through heart rate. Realistically, the most feasible method to look at something here with young players is to use a combination of time and RPE. RPE is where the player ranks how hard a particular session was out of 10, and the time then is obviously the actual time spent within the activity itself. So two particular examples here would be a gym session might be 40 minutes long. You ask the player to rate that out of 10 and they give it a 5 out of 10. We then multiply the time spent in the activity by the RPE to give an overall amount of units. Again, that example is 40 minutes by 5 out of 10, which gives us 200 units. Another example would be playing a match. A match is generally 60 minutes in length for an underage player. It might be a particularly hard game, so they rate it as 8 out of 10. We multiply those together and that gives us 480 units. That's more than double what the relatively straightforward gym session or resistance session was. So it has more than double the impact and load on the player. What do we actually do with these units? The most important thing is look to be as consistent as possible from week to week. We don't want any major jumps in the amount of units they're putting together. We also don't really want any big drop-offs in the amount of units they're doing. There isn't a set amount of units that you should aim for in a particular week, because the general RPE scale or rating of a player will vary from individual to individual anyway, and this will skew the amount of units they pull together in a week. What is most important is you don't want to have maybe 800 or 1,000 one week and then 2,000 the following week, because it's these big jumps that are the risk factors in both getting injured or getting sick, or both. If you notice your son or daughter, it's not a bad idea to track this with your own child or with a couple of players on the team you're training. And if you notice by Friday evening they have the same amount or more units than they would have in a typical week, then it might be worth pulling back ever so slightly on a Saturday or Sunday session. Whether it's either make it easier, sit out if it's not like a really important session that they need to attend, or you look at ways of only doing some of it so the overall minutes and intensity are pulled down a bit. Because like I said, it's these big jumps when they're getting really tired from an awful lot of load is when the chance of getting injured or sick are at their highest. The GAA's recent action statement on long-term athletic development has some nice markers here around how you can track internal and external load and how best to balance that over a training week or over a cycle in general. Once you've started monitoring and trying to manage training load, one of the most important things you can address then is general athletic development, often known as S&C. Now, S&C doesn't just have to be about going into the gym and lifting big weights. It generally won't be appropriate for the majority of young people going through the growth spurt. Developing movement competency, or how well you can perform various movements and exercises, is what becomes most important at this stage in development. The foundational movements that we'll touch on in a second, alongside all of the more pitch-based things like sprinting, hopping and jumping, are really important at this stage and will often require extra attention. A lot of particularly active young people will be quite good at this through ages 8 to 12, but will find they're not as good at this anymore once they start going through the growth spurt. This is because of the lack of coordination from just a generally longer or bigger body that there's more of to control. This means they'll often have to relearn or re-coordinate these movements before they can start adding any actual speed or power to their change of direction, their jump or their hopping and landing. It's really important to focus on quality of movement here before we look to build overall amount or intensity of movement. Bodyweight exercises like squatting, hinging, pushing, pulling and lunging should be the foundation of what's done. Most of these can be done in the pitch, or if you have access to some form of athletic development space, you're looking to develop these in your players through some bits of load that may actually help the movement, or through no load at all, based on their current level of competence, but also what you have access to. These are going to lay the foundation for everything you're doing after that, provided they can perform them well before you look to add load. In the same vein, skipping, hopping, jumping and landing are also going to become really important here, because they will develop some levels of strength there, but also because they do them so much on the pitch, it's important to be able to do these really well before we add intensity to them. How they land after each one of these movements, and ideally we're looking to develop them and perform them in a number of different directions, is going to be really important, but controlling that landing should form the focus of the majority of exercises you're doing, and realistically need to be included in pretty much every single session or prior to every match you're doing with players at this age. To link in with the GAA's action statement again here, they have a really nice framework broken into a few phases that looking at finding the position, holding the position, moving in and out of the position, challenging the position, then adding load. And that's the final stage. If you're unsure about how to integrate these into what you're currently doing, there's two options. There's some recognised warm-ups out there, the GAA 15, the FIFA 11 Plus, or the Camogie and Activate warm-ups, which take your strength-based exercises and your plyometric exercises, combine them into a sequential warm-up that give you options where you can mix in your sport-specific skills, hurling, football, camogie, at various stages throughout, and there's both videos and PDF handouts and all those. Other strategy I'd recommend is getting some form of consultancy with a qualified and experienced S&C coach who can work with the players and the coaches, not every week, but maybe on a month-to-month basis, because putting some time and effort to this is a huge investment for the long term of your players in terms of how much better they can get, improving how much they move, but also reducing the overall amount of injuries they're likely to pick up, plus a big positive development on the majority of your coaches. We look briefly at nutrition. I mentioned earlier that the adolescent growth spurt is the time where the second biggest amount of growth in their life. The biggest amount of growth in life is from birth to about 2 years old. Now think of what are some of the characteristics that a small child will do in those first few years. They'll do an awful lot of sleeping and they'll do an awful lot of eating. We need similar things in place for a teenager as they go through this growth spurt. They need to eat an awful lot of food. Their calorie demands or their total energy demands will be really high. Number one, to support the actual growth they're doing, but also because some of them lead really active lifestyles, they also need to fuel all of this activity. Their calorie needs will often be between 500 and 1,000 times more than a typical adult. Hence why they're often so hungry all the time. Neighbour of mine has 4 sons aged between 16 and 22. I said to him, you must spend some amount of food on groceries and food, and he said, John, every time I look up from the kitchen table, there's an arse sticking out of the fridge. That's just how much he needs to have there to fuel 4 sons that are all really active and play a lot of sport. It's important to have food for them in the house, various snack options that they like to eat will meet their nutritional demands alongside the typical meals that an adult would eat, they will need these extra snack options on the side. It's also important here to try and start giving them some little bit of guidance in terms of how to cook for themselves. While quite early in their teenage years, just being able to prep simple small meals that they have a little bit of control and ownership over will empower them to be able to feed themselves later on in life. Simple bits of education here, just basically on the 3 macronutrients. Protein, really important for growth and repair. Carbohydrates, important to fuel all the activity you're doing, and fats, important to soak up the nutrients from various foods. The majority of education here should be outsourced to a qualified and experienced professional. Can't rely on social media here because there's just too much conflicting information from crazy people who walk around supermarkets talking into their phone. Any nutrition education programs or nights or talks that you put on, I'd really encourage to have all the parents in attendance at this too. Encourage them to ask questions because they're far more likely to ask a question than the child is. They're going to have a bigger influence on what their child eats anyway because they'll generally buy the food, cook the food, prepare the food and decide what the child can have access to or not based on how much they might give money to around buying lunch and stuff. But it's also worth encouraging and facilitating little bits of conversation between the child or adolescent themselves and the parent so they can plan out within reason what they're actually going to eat together. 2 really important things I think it's worth focusing on if you're a parent and trying to develop good habits here around breakfast and school lunches. In general, for adults, you get away with skipping breakfast, but the overall impact on performance in school, sport, and general activity is massively negatively influenced by not having breakfast in young people. Discuss with them what they're happy to eat, likely to eat, and will still give them the nutrition that they require, alongside having a good quality school lunch. Really important factor here is sleep. I already mentioned that how the biggest amount of growth a person has in their life is from 0 to 2 years. And while they need not a fuel or nutrition or calories here, they also need a huge amount of sleep. It is a similar case for adolescents when they go through their growth spurt. They need an awful lot of sleep to cope with the demands of this actual growth. Plus, because they're relearning a lot of skills, both in terms of movement and sport-specific skills, this requires a lot of recovery and sleep time for that to be ingrained in their brain. While as adults, some of us might cope or function or even flourish on 6 to 7 hours sleep, it's very, very rarely the case for young people. Some might say they're okay on 6 hours, but realistically, the recommendations are 8 to 10, but I know from doing some of my own research around mental health and well-being in adolescence that 9 to 10 hours led to the lowest levels of anxiety and depression in adolescence plus the highest levels of well-being. There are suggestions around a possible shift in circadian rhythm for young people here in that they tend to become more owls and that they prefer to get up at 10 or 11 and go to sleep around 1 or 2. That might be the case, but realistically, school start times aren't going to change. Weekend training times, within reason, aren't going to be pushed back to 11 or 12 o'clock, particularly on a Saturday morning. So while it might suit them a little bit better to go to bed later and wake up later, there's too many other factors in life that are just going to prevent that from fully happening. What's important here is to have set bedtime routines that are consistent largely across the week, a little bit of wiggle room at weekends, but still within reason, not going from going to bed at 10 o'clock most nights to 1 or 2 o'clock on Friday and Saturday night. Limiting distractions in your bedroom, particularly phones, blue lights, games consoles, or anything else that's just likely to keep them awake. I find it very hard to justify caffeine or larger amounts of caffeine in young people, particularly later in the day. This caffeine will just create a debt or a tiredness or sleep debt that needs to be repaired somewhere else. It is important to tie this section together a little bit with the previous point in terms of how sleep and nutrition interact. I know a job I used to work in, the principal of the school, his son, really good level athlete, and he knew like the son had gotten nutrition guidance to ensure you're getting enough calories and have a sandwich before bed. But he was like, don't do that. It will have too much of a negative impact on your sleep. Realistically, you need to balance 2 of these out. Something like a sandwich probably isn't going to take huge effort or stomach discomfort to digest. It will provide the overall nutrition, energy, calories that's needed to keep an active young person topped up on fuel and shouldn't really negatively impact your nutrition. Where there are some other foods that just take a lot of digestion, might lead to indigestion, stomach discomfort, anything like that. So while you shouldn't be avoiding food coming up to bedtime because of how it'll negatively impact your sleep, it is worth looking at the foods that will help along with that. And something simple like some toast or cereal, a glass of milk, a sandwich, these will all be fine. They don't take that huge effort to digest. But there are other stuff like takeaways, pizzas, spice bags that will have a negative impact on sleep. So it's worth tying those 2 bits together. In terms of planning sessions, if you are a coach here, particularly on the circadian rhythm point, we don't need to push training back to 12 o'clock on a Saturday morning, but we do need to be smart within reason, and that probably isn't huge benefit to having under 14 or under 16 train at 7 o'clock in the morning. There probably is a happy medium here around 9 or half 9 and that. We can realistically expect them to be up by 8, have some little bit of fuel on board, make the journey to training, extend your warm-up a little bit, because it does just take young people that little bit longer to wake up at that time in the morning, but still have quite of an effective session once you've done the extended warm-up from half 9 to half 10 or a little bit longer. An often overlooked component, but what becomes really important at this particular age, is levels of mental and emotional support. Now, I don't mean going out and getting a sports psychologist to come in and talk to them, but just how you can structure a little bit of support for them that isn't the specific X's and O's of training or S&C that you might be doing. There's so many changes happening at this age in terms of their sport, their relationship with their sport, their bodies, their relationship with friends and family, and just their own selves. There'll be a lot of new friend groups, a lot of new interests varying further into a sport or potentially away from a sport. The sport they're playing might have been really important up to now, but now is potentially less so, or vice versa. This can often change with the right sport. They might come back to it and be really engaged in it again. And it often comes from that lack of confidence because they've this new body they're trying to deal with, but also a new friend group that isn't as interested in hurling or football or camogie as their previous friends might have been. There's a good chance there'll be a drop in performance. They're relearning all these skills in a new, bigger body that feels and looks different. You just need to be patient as they relearn all this stuff and don't be like, they used to be good, now they're not anymore. What's going wrong? Is it just not for them anymore? It's just a case of they need you to support them as they're getting back into their sport again. Early maturers, those who get that growth spurt a bit earlier, while they go through growth, they are just bigger and stronger than everyone else. They'll often have a bump in performance because they're bigger than all the other players. It's important to support them a little bit later on, because if they become to rely on this newfound size and strength, they'll struggle as all the other players catch up to them. On the flip side, the late maturers, those who don't get bigger and stronger till a bit, maybe 15 or 16, they'll have a dip in confidence quite early because the other players will be able to push them around a bit more, hit or kick the ball further. So you need to support them and say, if you develop all these skills, both the sport and the movement ones, when you catch up to them in terms of growth, you'll actually be far better in those. It's important to be patient at this stage. At this age group, try and give some element of choice or empowerment. It'll increase their overall buy-in to what it is you're doing. It'll also just help them feel a little bit more grown up and involved in the decision-making process. This is not a case of you giving them a choice on everything you do, but for example, you might do 3 different warm-ups and before a match you say, which warm-up did you prefer the best? I'm happy to use that one. They feel like they're having some bit of control over what it is they're doing, but you're still structuring this in a way that you're happy with the majority of things that are actually happening across the season or in trends. Don't be overly harsh on reductions in performance. Like I said, this is just a player relearning the sport in this new body. They need more of a carrot than a stick approach. While you're limiting how much you can do here, it is important to watch out for breakups in friendships. They'll have new interests. They'll be moving to secondary school, they'll meet new friends. Some might be friendly with players older, some might be friendly with players younger, some might be friends with people from the next parish or the next club. We can't overly impact who they're friends with, and we certainly can't force friendships. It is important to look out for particular breakups or conflict within your playing group and not force them to be together too much. Let it take its own course of action. Realistically, we've all played on teams with people we didn't necessarily like or get on with, but we still managed to find ways to perform together. It's all a part of growing up and will have knock-on benefits to other aspects of life when they get the jobs or anything that way. Not forcing too much time together though, which can lead to too much conflict and potentially having someone drop out because they just don't enjoy going to training, or some players maybe feeling isolated from a group, looking for ways to integrate them in as much as is possible. Across your playing group, there'll be changes in just general levels of interest and motivation, from session to session, from week to week, and from month to month. This often has very little to what you're doing. You might come up with the best, most progressive, interactive session you can think up, really good activities, loads of levels of challenge, working together, individual skill development, everything, and they're just not particularly interested. Another night you might go up, do the most basic warm-up ever, go into a game and everyone is absolutely loving it. It's generally nothing to do with you, it's their level of interest and all the other things in life that are impacting them at that particular time. Just aim to be consistent with your approach. What are the values you're bringing to it? What are the main aims you want to develop in your players, in your club, in your team, and in you as a coach? Look to stick to those and let them be your main guiding principles, as opposed to changing day to day or even within the session based on the level of interest the players are showing there in front of you. In the long term, the players will massively benefit from you being really consistent in your messaging, in your activities, and how you treat them once they get through this level of adolescence and mature at the far end of it. In summary, It's important to watch out for big growth spurts and big jumps in the overall amount of training they're doing. You can support players physically in terms of how they do various movements, making sure they're doing them well, and then potentially adding load or volume, but not both at the same time to that. There are going to be changes, physically, emotionally, mentally, across the board. Try stay consistent with what you're doing, support the players as much as possible, have discussions with parents, have opportunities for the players to bond more with each other, and to merge with the broader club so they feel a big part of that, as well as just their own team and unit. Your main focus should still be on the development of players. Just bear in mind, some players develop at different levels, at different stages and at different rates. If you're not sure of anything, particularly S&C or nutrition, outsource to a qualified, experienced professional who can give you, your club and the players and even their parents the guidance that's required in the correct format. Give your players some level of input here, a little bit of choice, but structure, scaffold this so it's still stuff you're really comfortable with doing, delivering, and having just the general final okay on. And for a little bit of extra guidance, get the youth resistance cheat sheet below, or have a look at this video up here for more guidance in this general area.